Good morning. How you guys doing? So I suspect that all of you at one time or another have heard of Muhammad Ali. And as the video indicated, he saw himself as the greatest boxer that ever lived. And many would agree. Thousands followed him. But he saw himself not only as a leader or a savior of the boxing world, he saw himself as a leader in religion and in politics and in culture. If you were alive at that time when he refused to go to Vietnam and when he changed his name and converted to Islam, people stood up and paid attention. They saw Muhammad Ali as someone who was bringing about change, who was a leader. And through the years that he lived, he accumulated wealth, accolades, and fame. And that became a measurement for leadership, a standard for leadership. But I would argue today that that type of leadership is elusive. It casts a shadow on what real leadership is. You say, what are you talking about? What are you proposing? Think about this for a moment. All of you here probably grew up playing Little League Baseball or soccer. When you started the season, did your coach ever say, you know what our goal is? Our goal is to lose every single game this year. We want to be losers. Or those of you that are in business, when you start out your fiscal year, the sales manager doesn't say, our objective is to lose lots of money this year, correct? We have been told since we were young that the objective is to do something significant, make something of yourself, be great. Yet I would suspect if I were to do a survey today of each of you gathered, and I were to say, do you feel like at this point in your life, whether you're young or old, that you've reached a place where you have achieved greatness, significance, value, worth? Most of you would say, no, I don't feel that way. And it comes back to what I'm saying, is that we oftentimes use the world's measurement, the yardstick, the tape measure, to define what greatness is. Yet the problem with the way that the world measures greatness is that it's constantly changing. Take baseball as an example. If you're a baseball player, a professional baseball player, your greatness is measured by how many home runs you've hit or what your batting average is. Or if you're in sales, how many sales you made, how many deals you've closed. But I would say that even that is subjective. Who's to say what is successful? And we live under that shadow. We struggle with saying, how exactly am I going to be perceived? How do I achieve or reach greatness? As we stop and we think about how we measure that, we would understand that even if you're here today and you would say, I feel like I've reached a point where I'm succeeding. But I would ask, do you feel like it's enough? Have you reached a place where you say, I feel fulfilled? Even John Rockefeller, when he was asked, how much is enough money? His response was, richest man of the 20th century, his response was, just a little bit more. So this morning, I want to offer a different measuring stick, a different way to ultimately talk about leadership. And I hope that as you adopt this scale, this yardstick, if you will, that Jesus offers, is that you would then transfer whatever yardstick, whatever measurement they're using to the one that Jesus offers. And my hope is that today, in the brief time that we have, is that I will inspire you to greatness. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to look at a passage in Mark chapter 10. If you brought a Bible, I want to ask you to open it up. If you have it on your phone, I want you to turn to it. Mark chapter 10, verse 35. Please share with someone next to you if you have one. And some of my pals passed out some outlines. I'm going to give you two principles and one big idea with each principle. And the big idea, I'm going to offer an action that I want you to take. And what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at what great leaders care about. I'm going to start reading in verse 35, this true story. I want you to listen to what two individuals requested in relationship to being a leader. And I want you to notice the conflict that surfaced from that. Mark records, then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him, speaking about Jesus. Teacher, they said, we want you to do whatever we ask. What do you want me to do for you? He asked. They replied, let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory. You don't know what you're asking, Jesus said. Can you drink the cup I drink or be baptized with the baptism I'm baptized with? We can, they answered. Jesus said to them, You will drink the cup I drink and be baptized with the baptism I'm baptized with. But to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared." Then the 10 heard this, and they became indignant with James and John. So the first thing I want you to take note of, as it comes on the screen, is that great leaders care more about relationship, being in a relationship, than being right. That is, a leader that is going to have lasting significance understands that caring for the people that follow him is of the utmost importance. So in this particular passage, what's going on is that Jesus, Brian talked about it, Jesus is at the height of his work. People are coming from all over the region. He's fed 5,000 men, as Brian described, and probably at least 5,000 children that were there with just 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread. He's healing people left and right. Diseases, leprosy, blindness. Those that are lame are learning to walk, and he's changing people's lives. And so here come 2 of his disciples, brothers, James and John, and they figure out that at this point, as his ministry is exploding and taking off, he's going to be establishing a cabinet. And so they want to be considered as the vice president and ultimately the chief of affairs. And so they pull Jesus aside and they say to him, "So we have a request that we want you to grant. We want you to do whatever we ask." Can I just say to you, that if you approach your boss this next week about a raise and you start with, "I want you to grant me whatever I ask," it's not going to go well. And yet Jesus responds with grace and an inquiry. He actually asks him, "What do you want me to do for you?" And here it comes. "We want to sit at your right and your left as you enter into glory." Let me reread what Jesus said, how he responded to them. "You don't know what you're asking," Jesus said. "Can you drink the cup I drink or be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with?" "We can," they answered. And Jesus said to them, "You will drink the cup I drink and be baptized with the baptism I'm baptized with. But to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared." If you don't understand what he's declaring, he's actually forecasting the fact that he's going to go to the cross and die on the cross. And he's saying, if you're going to travel with me, be the kind of leader that I am, it's going to require you to make great sacrifice. You're going to be baptized into suffering. They're completely oblivious to what this means and the implications of it. And they want to press forward. But the real key, if you didn't catch it, was the next verse and the other 10 disciples that are hanging out. And this is what they come to conclusion. Verse 41, when the 10 heard about this, they became indignant with John and James. They were furious. They were outraged. Well, they forgot one small aspect about being a leader, and that is to be a leader, you have to have followers. So here, among the 12, they've neglected the fact they need to care for the others, and they've come around behind their backs. They've made this outlandish request of Jesus to be at the top of the pack, and it doesn't go well. As we stop and we think about what is the real issue here, why have they done that? We can easily throw them and the rest of the disciples under the bus and going, that's not how it works. We know that leadership is common sense, so you have to think about others and be in relationship. But before we throw them under the bus, let's do some self-examination. Let's ask ourselves, how invested are we in others? Monica and I, my wife and I, we moved to Claremont, just a few blocks up the road, 17 years ago. So I remember about 9, maybe 10 years ago, when some restaurants began to open in this area of Laverne. And we were all excited about the new place to visit. Our kids were teenagers at the time, so they had sports, and I had church on Sunday, and so finding some places close by that had some good food was really encouraging and delightful for us. So I remember when Rubio's right down the street opened up. And on a Friday night, we came home from school and from work, and I said, hey, let's go out to eat tonight. There's a new restaurant over in the corner of Foothill and Fruit Street. I think it's called Rubio's. And my wife says, no, I'm pretty sure it's Baja Fresh. And I said, no, I'm certain it's Rubio's. No, seriously, I think it's Baja Fresh. So the kids are thinking, who really cares? Can we just go and eat? So we get in the car, we drive 5 minutes, and we pull up right into a parking space underneath the sign. And everything in me wants to say, you see, I was right. Your mom was wrong. Everybody, say it out loud. Dad was right. Have you been in that situation where you just think, I got to show to be an effective leader that I'm right and I'm always right? There are many occasions where I would have jumped on that, but let me just ask you a question. Let's suppose I had gone that route, got the kids on board, shamed their mom, said how good I was and how I was so knowledgeable. Do you think that would have endeared my wife to me? Do you think that would have inspired my children to greater respect and admiration as their dad? Absolutely not. Because the reason is that people want to follow humble leaders. If you're taking notes, write that down. That pride is at the root, and pride then sabotages good leadership. It's a repellent to great leadership. And we have to keep that in mind. So here's that very first action. Men, be humble. Make a choice every single day to clothe yourself in humility. Last week, I charged this with my church family. I said, when you leave in the morning, James talks about the fact of clothing yourselves in humility. Think about what humility looks like in your workplace. When you sit down at a meeting on Monday morning at 9 a.m., you ask yourself, what do my colleagues look like? How do they perceive humility? How can I emulate that to them? When you go home today and you spend time with your family, how do they perceive and understand humility? Make that your priority. In the situation that I described, I don't always do that. I don't always do it right. But in the situation I described, it was more important that I modeled to my children honor of their mother and elevated her respect than to prove that I was right. That's what we need to do as we consider what real humility and great leadership looks like. Now, here's the second principle that I want you to take note of. Great leaders care more about being less than being more. They understand, and this has been, you're probably going to hear some themes that have been running all through the day. And this is one of them, is that great leaders, sustainable leaders, realize that it's necessary to make sacrifice for those who follow them. So let me direct your attention then to verse 42. Jesus is going to address the whole group of disciples. Because it's not just James and John that have the issue, who want to press forward and then ultimately make themselves the leader. It's the whole group. And so Jesus responds, you know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be the slave of all. And so what Jesus is presenting to them, he's saying, just pay attention of what goes on in the world. Think about the yardstick or the tape measure of how leaders determine greatness. It's not hard for them to consider, as we saw that video earlier about the Roman soldiers. That's the oppression that they lived under. And guess what, guys? So do you. People ultimately in the world move to the top by stepping over others. Instruments of influence are abuse, oppression, and heavy authority. And Jesus says, don't you agree it wears you out? Doesn't it bring fatigue? And don't you feel like I can't live under these standards that are constantly changing? He says, be different. Take on a different nature and a different character. Make yourself less rather than more. And as he shares that with them, he's trying to convince them that servant leadership is the leadership that's going to be sustainable. That when we put others first, not thinking only of our own interests, but also to the interests of others, that becomes sustainable and desirable. This next picture comes on the screen. My daughter was 14. She's going to be 24 this summer. When she was 14, I coached the Claremont girls fast pitch softball team. I remember one particular Saturday, we were playing the city of Laverne. And the coach on Laverne's team, he actually visited our church the Sunday before. So I went over to him and shook his hand before the game, said hi to his daughter. And the game got started. It was a really close game, Claremont-Laverne. And about the 5th inning, we were down by 1 run. 2 outs, my daughter is on second base. So I'm coaching third. I'm over on the third base box. I call this play for the batter to do a fake bunt and a steal. And so everybody gets ready. My batter turns around, squares off for the bunt. My daughter starts sprinting down to third base. Laverne responds. Pitcher throws the pitch. Third baseman charges home in case it's a bunt. Catcher pops up, steps over the plate, fires down to third. The shortstop, who happens to be the Laverne coach's daughter, is sprinting to third, but 4 feet from the base, she comes to a stop. And the catcher fires a BB right into her mitt, blocking the base, tagging my daughter out, and ends the inning almost. Almost, I say, because at that point, I go ballistic. I start running down to where the umpire is. I said, did you clearly see that was a play? She stopped out there 4 feet. It's obstruction. My daughter should be safe. The play is safe. He says, no, it's not. And we continue to argue. Finally, the umpire says, if you don't back off, I'm going to kick you out of the game. You're going to have to leave. By this time, my players are getting back on the field, and my daughter, who is the catcher, is getting her gear on. So I march over to the dugout. I take my arm, and I slam it against the fence. I said, next time, take that girl out. And at that point, time stood still. My daughter's eyes were as big as saucers. And I looked around, and nobody was saying a word. They were all looking at me. And to make matters worse, the majority of them knew that I was a pastor. And so I had to, after the game, go and apologize to every person there, starting with my girls on my team. Then the next day on Sunday, in all 3 services, I had to apologize to my church for making a scene, not representing Christ and my church well. And I found out that day that when you try to make more of yourself, you inevitably make less of yourself. Contrast that with a friend of mine named Steve. Steve married this beautiful girl in college. They were a match made in heaven. Soon they adopted 2 children, and eventually they gave birth to 2 more. They were the perfect family, loving, happy, respectful. That wasn't until his wife reached her mid-30s, and she started demonstrating these physical symptoms that were concerning because, you see, her dad had Huntington's disease. And so they took her to the doctor, and after testing, they discovered, sure enough, she had this deadly disease called Huntington's disease. At first, they just pressed on. It didn't really seem to make a difference. The family was moving, the kids were growing, until finally she reached her 40s, and it became evident, and she couldn't go out of the house unless Steve took her. Soon she was confined to a wheelchair, and at that point, he was giving constant care. When he was at work, by the time she was in her late 40s, he taught high school full time. By the time that took place then, he then had to have a caregiver come in during the day to care for his wife. And by the time she reached her early 50s, for her own care, it was imperative that she would be placed into a facility for care. Can you imagine, those of you that are married, can you imagine your young wife in her early 50s, being confined to a bed, and by that time, not able to swallow or even speak? And yet, day after day, Steve would go to that facility and spend time with his wife, love her unconditionally, being a servant. On the occasion when I would go and visit them, oftentimes he'd be reading the Bible to her or singing a hymn to her or telling her a story about what happened at school. And her eyes would gleam and sparkle as she watched him speak. Last October, his wife went home to heaven, left a hole in Steve's heart, but an indelible imprint on mine. He epitomizes the man who makes himself less to be more. He epitomizes the servant leader, the kind of leader that you and I should be. So what's the action? It's you got to be courageous. Would you jot that down? Why do I say you have to be courageous? Well, use my friend Steve as an example. Think about the fear when you suspect loss. When you want to serve the person at work and potentially they're going to get the credit. In the back of your mind, you're thinking, they're going to go and they're going to tell the boss that they did all the work. And fear will overtake you. Fear will sabotage great leadership. You cannot be fearful. You have to have a faith in God and His sovereignty and trust that God has your back. And when you believe and you trust the Lord has a plan for your life and that He will use your humility and your courage as a vehicle to carry out His plan, you will see God do amazing things. Lift other people up, elevate those around you, and watch what will happen. See how God works. And that brings us then to the big idea. At our church, we call it the take-home truth. Here's the third principle I'd like you to write down, and that is that great leaders care more about character than they do credit. Put another way, that each of us want to be affirmed. We want others to acknowledge us, and that is normal and it's natural. But you and I, at times, will find that what we long for in regards to receiving credit is in conflict with the development of character. And I want to show you then how Jesus goes on to affirm this in the next verse, verse 45, which is the key verse in this story, and I would argue is the key verse in the four Gospels. Listen to what Jesus said as He's saying, don't make the mistake of using the wrong yardstick or tape measure. For even the Son of Man, He's talking about Himself, even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give His life as a ransom for many. Jesus Christ, as Brian spoke already, is the greatest leader that ever walked the face of this earth, and still today. And He demonstrated His leadership. One of my favorite verses, God showed His love for you and I in this. While you and I were still sinners, Christ Jesus came and did the very thing that He declared here. He said, I'm going to go and give up my life as a ransom to pay for people's sins. And if you're here today and you've not receive Jesus as your Savior, I want to challenge you to do that. Because if you want to obtain the kind of leadership that's being described today, it comes through the power of Jesus Christ and His Spirit. And so as Jesus said, I've come here to literally lay down my life, die on a cross, and pay for your sins. One of the other writers said that Jesus did not see, being the very nature of God, did not see equality with God something to be grasped, but took on the very nature of a servant, being made in human form. He gave all of that up as a model and an example of what great leadership looks, but most of all, to glorify His Father, as Brian had stated. That's where we're going to find the greatest success. So I want to finish by sharing a story with you. A picture's going to come on the screen. This is Officer David Sherrard. My son Tyler, he's a fire paramedic in Richardson, Texas. That's north Dallas. February 7th this year, I received a text from my son Tyler. And he said, Dad, in case you see on the news tonight or tomorrow morning about an active shooter in Richardson, I just want to put your mind at ease that I actually took my shift off today. I'm not at work. 2 days later, I called him. I said, hey, what was going on? What was the situation? He said, on my shift, my colleagues were called on this particular shooting. And there was an individual that had been shot in the leg. He's on the balcony. They arrived, Richardson Police, which is the department right next to where my son's station is. They were on the scene. He had a main artery bleeding, and so the paramedics tried to stop the bleeding and get him away from that particular area. And the police realized that the man had come out of this apartment and hadn't been secured. And so they ordered the paramedics to get away. And the police then came to that particular door, called for the individual inside to make some kind of response. No response whatsoever. And so Officer Sherrard, who was on the SWAT team, then went in first. The assailant was waiting for him with a gun drawn, shot, hit him just above his vest, and he was able to get back out of the apartment. Paramedics there grabbed him, got him in the ambulance, but before they get him to the hospital, he passed away. Following week, my son called me again. He said, Dad, it was absolutely amazing. I didn't realize, but David Sherrard attends my church, Watermark in Dallas. And he said there was a service for him this last Monday. 7,000 people came, filled the auditorium. He said Richardson Fire and Richardson Police were sitting down in front. And for an hour and a half, people got up and shared the story about his life. He said the first person that got up was a man that he'd been in a men's Bible study with for the last 10 years. And he talked about how David cared more about people and relationships than being right. He described how he was constantly concerned, not just for his family, but for the citizens of Richardson, for the other men in his Bible study, and the people at church. And talked about what a humble individual he was. The next person that got up was Officer Sherrard's partner, the man that rode side beside him in the squad car. And he went on to say the same thing. He said he is an individual, a person then of courage. He was always putting others above himself. Hence, that's the way that he died. He took the lead going into that apartment on that fateful night. And he said the same kind of individual that you saw here at church is the same kind of individual I rode right alongside in that car. And my son said the last person that got up to share that morning was his wife. And his wife went on to talk about the fact that the same man that you saw in the police department or out in the community or at church was the same man that you would see at home. That he loved her unconditionally. He was a servant leader who cared more about character than about credit. And she said that's the way he lived and that's the way that he died. And my son's response was, at 26 years of age, was, Dad, that if I ever give my life in the line of duty, I would want the men in my Bible study, and I would want my partner on the box, and I would want my wife to stand and say the same things about me that David Sherrard's friends and family said about him. So I want you to stand. I want to give you the last action. The last action is be persistent. If you are going to then ultimately grow to be the kind of leader that God has created you to be, you've got to be persistent. You have to let God work and let character grow and develop. You have to persevere. You can't quit. You can't give up. You can't surrender. And so I want you to say that out with me. I want you to say that. Don't surrender. Are you ready? Don't surrender. Again, don't surrender. Again, louder. Don't surrender. Don't surrender. Don't surrender. I want to finish with a moment of silence as this video shows of fallen officer Sherrard.